When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, one question that escaped all the attention in the drama and celebration that was going on was this: where did all the Soviet nuclear weapons go? After all, the Soviet Union, through 40 years of the Cold War, had got into an arms race with America. So there were tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. So where did all of that go? Now it's interesting that the country which had the third highest number of nuclear weapons, warheads and other destroyers back in the summer of 1991 was not Britain or Canada or France, it was Ukraine. By some estimates, Ukraine had 1,800 nuclear warheads. That was second only to the United States and to Russia. Ukraine also had the biggest number of nuclear silos and military bases that were nuclear enabled. Now, this collection included intercontinental ballistic missiles, strategic bombers, nuclear-enabled weapon systems. So when Ukraine declared independence back in August of 1991, it de facto ended up with almost a third of the entire nuclear arsenal that the Soviet Union possessed. Today, 30 years later, it is these very same nuclear weapons that may be the secret reason why Vladimir Putin is threatening to invade Ukraine. On this week's CRUX Decode, I look at whether there are secrets about the old Ukrainian nuclear program which the Russians are aware of and are willing to risk a full-blown war for. So soon after Ukraine became independent, it had a host of issues to deal with. There were economic and social aspirations of the people. There was a recession going on at the time. There was a run on its banks. Dealing with an inherited legacy of nuclear weapons amidst all of this was not exactly top priority for Ukraine's new rulers. So Ukraine got into negotiations with the International Atomic Energy Agency. In 1994, it proposed that Ukraine join what is called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT. Now, as part of this treaty and as part of Ukraine agreeing to join this treaty, it meant that Ukraine had to destroy all of its nuclear weapons. So a large part of Ukraine's nuclear weapons arsenal had to be either returned to Russia, where it would be destroyed, or it had to be turned over to the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, which would in turn then dismantle that nuclear weapon. Now, the IAEA's job was to help Ukraine get rid of all of its nuclear weapons. Later on, after a few years of this process, the IAEA, the agency, went on to file a report, this was back in the late 2000s, which seemed to suggest that Ukraine had taken down a large part, a majority of its nuclear arsenal. But there was still some unanswered questions. We'll get to those unanswered questions in a second, but first, let's focus on this. Soon after independence, like I said, Ukraine was facing a major economic crisis. There was international isolation as well. And therefore, some argued that Ukraine was forced to sign in 1994 what was called the Budapest Memorandum. As per this Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine would transfer all its nuclear warheads to Russia, and in Russia, these nuclear warheads would be dismantled. In exchange, what does Ukraine get? It gets security assurances both from Russia as well as from Western countries. Now, this accord, like I said, was known as the Budapest Memorandum. It was signed in 1994 between Russia, Ukraine, Britain, and the United States. Now, what this memorandum promised, that none of these four countries would ever use force or threats against Ukraine, and that all of these four countries would respect Ukraine's sovereignty and its borders. That agreement also said that if any of these countries were to aggressively go to war with Ukraine, then all the signatories to this Budapest Memorandum would immediately rush to the United Nations Security Council, which would then help Ukraine. The irony is this: 20 years after the Budapest Memorandum was signed, Russia attacked Ukraine in 2014. It annexed Crimea. It also set up a huge number of insurgent groups, particularly in the eastern region of Donbass, which Vladimir Putin is now threatening to invade. So in 2014, after the Russian troops invaded Crimea, it was just a matter of days. It was literally like Putin and his forces just walked in, annexed territory, and walked back. Vladimir Putin at that time in 2014 dismissed the Budapest Memorandum as null and void. In Ukraine, there were a lot of people asking some very tough questions, very serious questions. Many were saying it's time to get nuclear weapons back in the country for atomic rearmament, that the country should once again get nuclear weapons. In March 2014, for example, Vladimir Orzinko, who is the Ukrainian foreign minister, argued that Ukraine now had both a moral and a legal right to get its nuclear status back again. Later that year, there was a poll conducted in Ukraine which showed almost 50%, almost half of the country, was in favor of Ukraine getting its nuclear arms back. Last year, Ukraine's ambassador to Germany said that Kiev might actually look to nuclear arms if it cannot become a full member of NATO, because ultimately it needs some kind of protection, some kind of deterrent against these repeated skirmishes and attacks, and of course the threat of war that Russia is presenting itself with. Now, the prevalent feeling, particularly after 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, was that what if Ukraine had nuclear weapons? Would Putin have so easily walked over and annexed the sovereign territory of another country had he known that that country had nuclear weapons? The answer, maybe not. Now, throughout the many debates, political, economic, military, that have happened in the run-up to the imminent invasion of Ukraine, as many have characterized it in the West, many folks in Ukraine and in the West have been saying that Russia wants to invade Ukraine for these nuclear reserves, as well as the military resources that were held within these former secret military bases that the Soviet Union had in Ukraine. Remember, I said about a third of Ukraine's nuclear assets, a third of the Soviet Union's nuclear assets went to Ukraine at the time that the Soviet Union collapsed. So there is a possibility of Russia, and particularly Vladimir Putin and some of his old KGB comrades, knowing that there are still hidden nuclear weapons within Ukraine, some of which have not been accounted for. Remember, since 2015, Ukraine's uranium reserves, and this has been put out by the IAEA as well as other agencies, Ukraine's uranium reserves have been going down significantly. At around 2015, it was about 200,000 tons or so of enriched uranium. That has come down to about 80,000 tons in the last report that was presented in 2020. This was a review done by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, a substantial amount of these reserves could have been traded with other countries. Remember, nuclear material is used also for electricity generation in nuclear power plants. So a whole host of countries would have bought this enriched uranium from Ukraine. But the IAEA simply cannot account for all of the 100,000 plus or 120,000 missing tons of enriched uranium, a lot of which Ukraine says it has sold to other countries. Now, where is this unaccounted secret uranium gone? Has it gone into making a weapons program? Has it gone into feeding the old warheads that Ukraine had and it inherited from Russia at the time of the Soviet Union collapsing? Now, one other very important factor is that the only working nuclear agreement between Russia and the United States, which both countries have signed on and is still very much working on the ground, it's called the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START. Now, the first START was signed somewhere in the mid-90s. It was basically an agreement to cap the number of nuclear warheads, both for Washington as well as for Moscow. The second START, or the new version of START, the one that is currently on, was signed in 2010, when, of course, Obama was president of the United States and Medvedev was president of the Russian Federation. And at that time, Obama had famously called it the Russian reset. Now, this was completely despised by Vladimir Putin. Putin basically felt that the whole reset was Russia getting served a raw deal, which is why, after a few years, he was prime minister at that time, he came back in what was considered another coup by Vladimir Putin. He came back as president once again by amending the Russian constitution. Now, this START agreement, basically the one that's been running since the mid-90s all the way through to February 2026, when this current one expires. What this agreement says is it basically caps the number of nuclear warheads, both for America and for Russia, at about 6,000. So both of the countries cannot develop any more nuclear warheads beyond the current capped limit of 6,000. So by threatening to invade Ukraine, by trying to put pressure on Ukraine, Putin is also conveying a message to America and to the West that he's basically now laying down the ground rules for a new START 2 agreement. Like I said, the current START agreement expires in February of 2026, so they need a START 2 agreement to maintain the level of nuclear warheads both in Russia and in the United States to start being operational from February 2026. So this is Putin's way of suggesting to Washington and to its allies that, look, there are going to be new ground rules as far as nuclear weapons are concerned, and America and its allies have to follow those ground rules. And he's using the chip or the card of Ukraine and the threat of invasion of Ukraine to get America to the drawing board for a START 2 on terms that are favorable to Russia.